I'm going to set things up, but other than that, I'll be like the Maytag repairman. I have very little. I've got two very smart people who have a lot to say. But with me here are two people who, as you know, are pillars of the Miami civic and intellectual community. Dennis Scholl wears many hats. He is, of course, Vice President for the Arts at the Knight Foundation, and as many of you know, a key figure in the revitalization of various aspects of Miami, major collector, major voice for the arts, and through the Knight Foundation job, very influential figure on the national scene, but who's also been a very serious student, if you will, of museums and public policy around museums at Harvard and elsewhere. Stephen, old friend, is a relatively recent arrival to Miami, a professor at the School of Law here. He's a nationally recognized expert on cultural property law, but also knows a lot about tax and estate law, and has run a museum and has worked in a foundation. So the two of them really bring a tremendous amount of background and context to our topic. Now, our topic is perhaps a little bit more, less, how should I say, entertaining and lighthearted than some of the topics we see here in the salons. However, it's very, very serious, and while the circumstances that we'll speak about are rather dire and, frankly, very unusual, they do raise some big questions about museums and their place in the society of both of the United States and overseas. You'll hear more of this context in a minute, but as you all know, Detroit is heavily in debt, $20 billion in debt, more or less, an unprecedented municipal bankruptcy. And many of us in the art world were rather alarmed, continue to be alarmed, when Detroit's great museum, the wonderful Detroit Institute of Arts, found itself being a subplot of this story. This is, of course, to those of you who haven't visited, it's a 128-year-old esteemed, wonderful museum, one of America's great, truly great, one of the world's great museums, which it has been suggested being an asset of Detroit in ways that will be explained in a minute, maybe a source of liquefiable assets to ease this bankruptcy situation. Christie's, as you may have read, delivered yesterday its report. Christie's Auction House was retained to evaluate part of the collection to see what it's worth. More on that in a minute as well. And where we are now is an interesting moment, but one where we can stop and sort of think about what all this means. I want to be clear, though, the museum is not broke. Detroit is broke. No one yet has said, sell these assets. Although there's been a lot of discussion. And I can almost guarantee you that this story is not coming to a museum near you. In fact, we still don't know if it's coming to Detroit. But
I agree with all that except for the last comment.
Actually, let me clarify. It may be coming to a museum near you. And that should be one of the things we talk about because, you know, all around the world we have this vastly built museum infrastructure coexisting with municipalities that are struggling, particularly out of major cities. So what we want to talk about and sort of circumnavigate today is what does this say about museums, particularly in the US? What are the arguments for and against these types of actions, legal, policy, moral arguments? And how can institutions and communities prepare for, counteract, mitigate, these types of circumstances. And so what we'll do is Stephen will set up a little bit of the legal context. Now, Stephen knows that we're at an art fair, so this is not a law school seminar. So he's going to be very gentle, and he's going to explain things as he goes.
Keep it light and airy.
You know, we're at a fluffy little art fair situation. And Dennis then, with the deep insight, or as much as he is allowed to share, will tell us a little bit about the context. And then we have a number of questions. One thing we do want to avoid, though, is to generate or recapitulate false rumors. That is certainly not our goal. What we really would like to do is flesh out the situation and see what we can learn from it. So we'll go from there. We'll leave time for questions for you guys. And I guess I'll ask Stephen, what's the situation?
Okay, we should be on, right? All right. Andras, thank you. Dennis, this is going to be fun. And I want to thank Claudio for setting this conversation up for us. What I want to do in 5 minutes is to give you my full semester-long 3-credit course in art law and the one I also teach in museum law. All right. What I very brief. Are we still on? Yeah. When we spoke, the thought is that I would just set up the landscape, the legal landscape, and then Dennis will fill in with the facts on the ground, and then we'll go from there. I want very briefly to talk about the U.S. art system, particularly for visitors here from other countries, because we have a unique art system. I want to talk very briefly about the law governing U.S. museums, and then very briefly mention what laws are applicable to museums, what laws are applicable in the situation of a sale of art, and also then what law is applicable in bankruptcy. Okay, the U.S. art system. Our art system is unique. We have no cabinet-level position in the executive branch for a minister of culture, for a secretary of culture. We never have in the United States, and I don't want to predict the future, but that's where we stand, whereas most countries in the world that do have the kinds of collections we have ministries of culture embedded in the federal government. Our system, our art world system, is by and large privatized. It is not governmental. All right, we'll come back to that later. Our museum system is primarily funded through the private sector, through gifts, grants, contributions, and earned revenue, versus governmental funding, which is the case elsewhere. The control of our museum system is, by and large, with boards of trustees, boards of directors, rather than with governmental entities. And finally, a very important point about our U.S. Art world system is, unlike almost every country in the world that possesses valuable collections, we have virtually no limitation on what may be exported from the United States. All right? The only thing that can be regulated by the U.S. Customs Service in terms of export of cultural property are Native American artifacts found on federal lands. Second, U.S. art museums. Okay, what do I want to say about that? Our art museums are part of what we call, in describing our economy, the third sector. The first sector being governmental, the second being the private sector for profit, and the third being the private, non-governmental, non-profit sector. Within that, our museums occupy a very special place because they are charitable entities. There are many nonprofits that are not charitable. Museums are by virtue of their educational purposes. By and large, with certain exceptions we all know for local museums, county museums, state museums, our museum system has been created and is primarily funded by private initiative for the benefit, though, of the general public. Most of our museums...
Let's not forget that phrase as we go forward.
Which one?
For the benefit of.
Oh, absolutely. I'm just sneaking in here because you're going to hear it for the rest of the hour. And they serve public purposes, all right? Education, awareness, so on and so forth, all right? Most of our museums are established as nonprofit corporations, but our law, either our common law, judge-made law, or by statute, these entities, the people who own and run our museums, the boards of directors and their trustees, are deemed to be fiduciaries, people in a position of trust. Therefore, they must be faithful, and they are treated as if they were trustees of a charitable trust, even if the museum is set up as a corporation. The basic fiduciary duties of a museum trustee is a duty of care to act as a reasonably prudent individual would under the same circumstances. I'm really summarizing here, but that's okay. And a duty of loyalty, that's a duty to avoid conflicts of interest. All right. Now, deaccessioning in American museums typically involves, whenever I've been on a discussion of deaccessioning, it's always been a situation where there has been a history of trustees breaching their duty of care, long-term financial decline, and then suddenly grabbing for the goods to sell them. Not the situation here that we're talking about, all right? Detroit, as Dennis I think will explain for us, is a unique situation by virtue of its history, all right? We'll come back to that, it's an important point. Very quickly then, applicable law. Museums, by and large, museums are governed under state law here, Michigan, all right? The exception to that is the Internal Revenue Code oversees their compliance with the tax code, and here, by virtue of the Bankruptcy Code, federal law is involved there. At the state level, the Attorney General represents the general public's interest in museums and is the individual with standing to confront the trustees and enforce the charitable trust. Sales of art in this country, and this is critical, it'll come up later. From the point of view of the law, selling a work of art is absolutely no different than selling a pencil or a ton of coal. It's tangible personal property, and the buying and selling of works of art in this country is controlled by every state's enactment of the Uniform Commercial Code. Exceptions, earthworks, conceptual art, and so on. All right? And one of the questions we'll look at is, how does art differ from those other forms of chattel? And finally, bankruptcy law is federal law. And here we're involved in an unusual situation. We've all heard, maybe some of us have experienced, either Chapter 7 or Chapter 11 bankruptcy affecting individuals or corporate entities, respectively. This is a Chapter 9 bankruptcy, which is a chapter of the Bankruptcy Code that applies uniquely to municipalities, a political sub-unit of a state. And I'm not a bankruptcy lawyer, but I think from time to time in this discussion, all three of us may need to point out from time to time some of the unique characteristics of a Chapter 9 bankruptcy filing. Okay, that's my kind of brief, quick survey. And anything that I should have mentioned, gentlemen?
No, I think we're good. There will be a test, by the way, very soon, so
Being
hang
handed
on.
out now.
I think maybe just a clarification, Stephen. So, as a lawyer, when you look at this situation, what is your first reaction? What are you thinking from the perspective of a lawyer?
My first reaction is, what a shame things are set up this way. And I think Dennis will have more to say about that. Virtually all of our great museums are deemed to be private entities, their collections are owned. Legal title to their collections is owned by their board of directors, their board of trustees, all right? And they hold them in trust for the public. That is not the situation in Detroit. That is the key issue, and it results from historical circumstances, and it is why we're discussing this today.
Perfect.
And I think you also said the most important thing earlier on. The museum is not in bankruptcy. I've run through their last several tax returns. They're in good health. It's the city that owns the collection that the Detroit Institute of the Arts manages for the public that is in trouble.
So here we are. Those are the facts on the ground, and now some more facts on the ground. Dennis.
So I'll quote my friend Roberta Smith in an article she wrote a few months ago. When bad things happen to good museums, this is the story. This is the Hobson's choice that we face. I'm going to give you 4 dates. 1885, the museum is founded. 1919, museum wakes up and says, gee, we're not doing so great. We're in a little trouble. We've got these beautiful assets. We've got a beautiful building. We have an amazing collection. Well, cities never go bankrupt. Let's transfer the collection to the city. That was a bad day. 1955 was the last time that the city spent $1 to acquire art for the museum. 1977. Since 1977, the city has never given the museum more than $500 or $600 or $700,000 in a year. So the city has played virtually no role in the health, vitality, and welfare of the museum for decades. For decades. So that's where you wake up in a situation like this. Obviously, Detroit as a city has been in decline since the 50s. And so the drama that arises from that all goes back to a decision that was made in 1919 because the museum got in trouble and felt like they wanted to protect the assets by sending them to the city where they'd be safe. Roll forward, of course, to current times, and the city appoints an emergency manager. Happens to be a guy I used to practice law with, actually. He went to the University of Michigan, and he practiced law down here in Miami. His name is Kevin Orr. And I'll give this one back to Stephen in a minute, but in Chapter 9, the judge cannot make the city sell assets. They can't make them do it. That doesn't mean they can't put a lot of pressure on them to do a lot of different things. Kevin arrives, looks around, and he falls into the same situation that those of you that followed the Rose Art Museum situation when Jonah woke up as the president of the university and said, well, we're just going to sell the art collection because we're having a bad month in the portfolio and I don't want to lay people off. He's still unemployed. But the situation that happened in Detroit is that Kevin woke up and he fell into that trick situation where you start saying, well, if pensioners have to eat cat food versus keeping a Cezanne, then the Cezanne goes. And that was the kind of the initial volley that came out of the emergency manager. Subsequently, the Attorney General came out and said, can't sell the art. Of course, this is not a state issue, it's a federal bankruptcy issue, as you noted. Christie's is brought in, they do an appraisal. The most recent numbers, I think, were, and they only appraised things that the city had either totally or partially given money to, toward acquisition. And they came up with a number that was between $480 and $960 million.
And just for clarification, you have a collection of 6,000?
Oh, no, many
60,000,
more. Yeah,
60,000 objects. Christie's looked at a fraction of those objects, and actually a fraction of those objects were deemed to have high, significant value in this context.
Yeah. I mean, the museum has thousands and thousands of objects that are not, auctionable, saleable for any price. So this is where it sits. The judge in the bankruptcy asked the chief judge of the court to try to mediate a solution, try to see if there was a way to do it other than actually selling the art. And and I can only speak to the public aspects of this because I am knee deep in this right now. But there have been a number of discussions with various entities who care about Detroit. And I have been quoted many times in saying I'm obsessed with Detroit because I think it will turn around and become the next great city in America again. It is the Berlin of America, if you will, when it comes to art and artistic practice, and people are moving there every single day. But the judge has drawn people together and said, well, what can we do about this? Well, why not just rent the collection? I mean, that's what the Barnes did when they were trying to improve the facility that they've just left. But many of these solutions are not practical. Interestingly enough, the silent majority is beginning to respond, as they do in a real crisis. Yesterday, a gentleman came forward and said he would give $5 million to save the collection. Just a gentleman who Detroit had been good to him. He'd made a lot of money in biotech, and he came forward. There are a number, again, this is all public information, there are a number of foundations that have come forward and began to have some discussions. Now, is that the right answer? Is it an appropriate response? Do we really want to get in the business of bailing out the collection in a situation where, as opposed to litigating all the way through and seeing? And I'm very interested in I'm going to put Stephen's feet to the fire and ask him if this goes down the road and gets litigated, what will be the result? But that brings you kind of up to yesterday. The drama is immense. The city is on hold. The museum has been put in an untenable situation. 3 contiguous counties last year voted to assess themselves to help the museum, which is not in any of their jurisdictions. I'm wondering how many people from Broward and Palm Beach and Monroe County would vote to give money to a museum in Miami. Well, they did it in Detroit, and they agreed to give $23 million a year for the next 10 years to save the museum. We were all high-fiving in the streets, we were all celebrating, and suddenly this happened. And I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. So I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, well, can we just hold, unless it's really crucial, I just would like us to lay things out a little bit first, but.
Is it relevant to know what happened in 1919 when you gave it to the city?
I don't know, what happened in 1919?
1919, the art collection had been title of the art collection was transferred from the nonprofit corporation that had been established in 1885 to the city. 4 years previously, their building and some other real estate they held had been transferred.
Right. So
because the museum was in trouble, they were struggling financially.
Yeah, what had happened is that there had been a lawsuit because the city began to fund the museum, and a lawsuit was brought to stop that funding on the theory that the city could fund only municipal agencies. And again, because it's a private organization, the plaintiff there was complaining about the city's appropriation of funds for a private entity, even though it was serving the public. We could go on from there.
First of all, I love the idea, the gorgeous metaphor of Berlin. Detroit is the Berlin of the United States. Having grown up behind the Iron Curtain, it did last for 50 years before it became this very nice Berlin again.
As will this, unfortunately.
So my question is, first of all, if it goes down the legal road, or if it just goes down the sort of path of public outcry, people responding, foundations, private individuals sort of, picking it up, how long is, first of all, what kind of horizon do you expect this to be played out on? And what kind of position does that put the museum in?
Well, nobody knows is the answer to that, right? But it's to the benefit of the creditors and of the city for a rapid resolution here, for reaching some kind of plan of adjustment as quickly as possible. If this turns into a litigated matter where the Detroit Institute of the Arts is suing to maintain its collection, trying to enforce the Attorney General's opinion that the artwork cannot be sold under these circumstances because it is held in public trust for the benefit of Michigan residents and Detroit citizens, it could be very long. Mm-hmm. But that almost begs the question, it really begs the question. The law is a ham-handed way of handling cultural property disputes. And at least the private sector, our museum sector, has grown up to understand that in the last 20 years in an extraordinary way. The question is whether or not a federal bankruptcy judge can learn those lessons quickly.
Mm-hmm. By the way, just to be clear, is there actually a precedent for this situation? Or are we sort of in terra incognita right now?
Terra incognita.
So really, well, it's good. It's certainly an interesting case. So, in the opinion of you two guys, is the real argument in this situation a legal argument? The powerful arguments, a legal argument? Is it a kind of economic argument to say Detroit cannot possibly rebound if you don't have these kinds of civic assets? Is it a moral argument?
We were taught in law school, if you have the facts, you argue the law, and if you don't have the facts, you argue the equities, to argue what's fair, what's the blue sky. I am interested in what you think about, if you were the museum, do you negotiate in this situation? Or what is your reading of what will happen in Chapter 9, and whether the museum can simply fold its arms and say, we don't think this is saleable. We don't think well, obviously nobody thinks it should be sold, but we don't think it, except for a few folks who are trying to get a quarter of a cent more on their bond return. But we don't think this art is saleable. We don't think it can be sold based upon either the Attorney General's opinion or the equitable argument of the fact that it's held in public trust. If they were to fold their arms and take that position, and that has been a possibility all along, what do you think the result of that would be? Forgetting about all the discussion, mediation, negotiations that's going on.
It's a really very good question. It would be a mistake. This is a time I believe, for the Detroit Institute of the Arts to be very proactive. not legally, but in as many other ways as possible. They need to be really getting their message out as to why these assets should not be sold. And something you said, Dennis, is very important, that under a Chapter 9 bankruptcy proceeding, a federal judge cannot order the city to sell any assets, but the federal judge must find an equitable and fair resolution. And so it would seem to me that the key thing now for supporters of the museum itself, is to be busily working to make the arguments that will read well, that are pithy, that are sharp, as to why this federal bankruptcy judge should simply take this issue off the table.
So the argument that is often mentioned in the press, which the director has made very eloquently, is that if something like this happens, it will be impossible for the museum to keep doing its work.
Well, he said the museum would liquidate. They would have no choice. If you go back to the $23 million a year, that represents 70% of the museum's, over 70% of the museum's $31 million budget. Two of the three counties that passed that referendum, the boards of the counties, the commissioners, have announced that if they sell one piece of art, that they will seek to revoke the money that's going to the museum. The interesting thing to me about the public is that the public was polled in the last 90 days or so. 78% of the public in Detroit that was polled said that they did not believe that art should be sold to satisfy creditors. And even the more difficult argument, obviously, with regard to the pensioners, but 75% of the public said that they did not believe that art should be sold to maintain pensioners' pensions. So there's a tremendous groundswell of support coming out of Detroit to preserve the museum, to preserve its heritage, to preserve what it means to the community. Tremendous groundswell.
Well, that's great. And, we're happy. I mean, that's how it should be.
But
it still leaves the question of how. What are the mechanisms to get from here to there? So even if there is an outcry, I think in the larger sense, one of the things I'm really struck by, and we had a conversation about this yesterday, is that, in our society, we have mechanisms to socialize risk. We have insurance. So if we have Katrina or hurricane or something happens, then there are mechanisms that disperse the costs of rebuilding, right? There are ways in which we come together to counteract natural disasters, for example. Somehow, when the museum finds itself in trouble, there are no lifelines to call in. There are no mechanisms in place to deal with a situation like this. Do they have to be invented? I mean, it seems as though, for example, the foundation community isn't set up to handle a situation like this, or there are no direct programs in place to come to the rescue. No rescue mechanism.
Yeah, I don't want to go too close to the bright light of the foundation situation, because like I said, we're right in the middle of it right now. It is public knowledge that there is a mediated type of discussion going on between foundations. There are people coming forth, like this gentleman yesterday, with money to save the collection. But do we really want to put ourselves as a society in a position where we're ransoming our community's assets? Is that really what we want to do?
So it sounds like your answer to Stephen's question, speaking as another recovering lawyer, is fight it.
It's a difficult question. I mean, this is a Hobson's choice. It's a horrible place to be.
Because I don't think I was suggesting fight it. I was suggesting promoting the message as to what these collections mean for Detroit's recovery, what that museum means for the future of the city, and why any risk posed through this bankruptcy proceeding that would in any way endanger its vitality is significantly going to undercut that city's ability. Mm-hmm. Now, here we get into two problems, real quick. Do you want to? No, okay. Two things. First of all, the American museum community is just utterly inept in terms of lobbying. They've never been, look at fractional gifts, right? This was a mainstay of contributions to our museum community, and the American museum community simply let it go without a fight. They didn't even know that the bill was coming down the pike. I can go through a dozen examples of this. Our tax law does permit museums to lobby. It can't be more than a small commitment of their funds, but like all citizens, they should be involved in the political process, but haven't been. We can talk about why that's the case. And I think the other issue there is, well, let me just leave it at that, all right?
Yeah.
So this is something museums aren't accustomed to doing, which is making their case. And the other thing is they need to make it in multiple ways. Yes, go ahead.
But
Well,
that sort of raises the larger question, which I think in the cultural world is always a question of the sorts of arguments that are being made to get public resources or resources of any kind for culture, and that these arguments tend not to be particularly powerful, or that the sector in general hasn't been very good at making these arguments. In the old days, lots of Shakespeare quotes and beautiful words about the beauty and the value of culture, which don't seem to work particularly well, certainly with government officials. More recently, this sort of very utilitarian arguments about art as a means to safer streets and better communities. I mean, it seems that the rhetoric of advocacy isn't very powerful, and it also seems that there aren't people there to make those arguments, even if they existed.
I worry that the judge in this situation is used to dealing with bankruptcies where you've got 3 trucks, a warehouse full of inventory, and a bunch of creditors. That's not the situation here. Private businesses go bankrupt all the time. The reason that people don't think about that in the context of cities, because you think of cities as being in perpetuity. They go on forever. And in this case, so I worry that there's not that kind of thoughtfulness that's going to go into the analysis, either by the manager or by the judge, because it's not the kind of thing that any of us have seen before. We just asked Stephen, anything like this out there? There's nothing like this out there. But what Detroit has, the DIA has, is it is a world-class institution. It has some of the greatest works of art ever created in their collection. And they are able to point to the judge and say, sell one painting, and the community loses $230 million from people that don't even live here. So that's a pretty powerful argument for not messing with the collection, I think, because I think it's an economic argument that can be made clear to the judge, as opposed to those arguments of, as I'm saying, held in public trust. And I would like you to touch upon that. You still never answered my question. If they fold their arms and say, we're going to lobby and do all those things, what's going to happen in the Chapter 9 bankruptcy? It all comes down to the power of the manager, doesn't it? The manager says we're going to sell these assets, then that's it.
Well, yes and no, because the judge still has to approve the plan of adjustment. All right? And we have to go back to understanding that Chapter 9 entered the bankruptcy code with 2 purposes. One was to provide a fresh start for a troubled municipality. Second was to rehabilitate the municipality that sought protection under Chapter 9. So it has a dual purpose: fresh start, but rehabilitation of the mechanisms so the city won't get back into the situation. Right?
Which we're seeing in Stockton now and other places,
right,
where they adjusted the pensions, but they didn't do enough to allow them to continue to operate, and they're falling back into the same situation. So that makes
So
it
are you saying that at the end of the day, I mean, we don't know, but some deal is made, the arguments are made, pro and con, and some X number is assessed?
No.
Is that no?
No, I'm getting away from it. I'm simply saying, at this point, from my perspective, the strongest thing that the museum and that community could do, the community that wants to protect the assets, protect the collections, would be to start making these arguments in an eloquent way. We can talk about the fact that politicians and judges tend to respond to instrumental arguments. The arts are good because they do something else. This is not the time to sit back and say, can't we get some good essentialist reason out there as to why the arts are really in and of themselves valuable? This isn't the time to do that. But you're right, Andras. arts community has never sat back and taken time to do that, and this may be a good moment. This may be the threat, at least the museum community needs, really to take time to articulate those essentialist arguments. But right now, I would be huddled with some of the best PR people I could find and begin making the case as to why this collection, as is without any sales, is utterly essential to Detroit's future.
I have a couple of questions. One, as a technical matter, speaking of the museum community, we have, of course, two very important museum associations, the AAMD, Association of Museums, and Association of Museum Directors. Both of them have very, very strict guidelines against deaccessioning. Were that sale of that one piece to happen, would the museum de facto be what would the implications be from that standpoint?
Well, it's an interesting question because it would not be a willful deaccession. Normally what you can do, many of you know this, is you can deassess so long as you take the money that you get from deaccession, use it to continue to build the collection. You sell something, you buy other things or something else.
So they would get a waiver, they wouldn't lose their museum status.
Well, actually, there are three codes of ethics. There's the International Council of Museums US, ICOM US. There is now what we for many years knew as the American Association of Museums, now the American Alliance of Museums, and then the Association of Art Museum Directors that represents the 200 largest art museums in North America. Both ICOM and AAM permit the sales proceeds to be used either for acquisition of new works or direct collections care.
Right.
The Association of Art Museum Directors is very strict and saying that the proceeds from sale of deaccessioned works that have been accessioned into the collection may be used solely for acquiring new works, and it was the first provision in its code of ethics to have an enforcement provision included. There's now a new one for another issue. But AMD signaled a number of years ago its seriousness of purpose here. But again, I think Dennis hit it on the head. This would not be a voluntary or willful deaccession.
Right. So
I spend a lot of time with the DIA folks. It definitely would not be voluntary.
yeah, well, of course. I suppose it's a very loose interpretation of collections care, right? When anyway, no joke there. A few questions. One is, you raised the very scary prospect that this story may, in fact, be coming to a museum near you, which begs the question then, what steps should museums, what should boards around the country be doing now to say, what should their emergency plans be? What are the decisions they should be making? What are the determinations they should be making to prevent this to happen from them?
It's very unlikely that this same situation will occur, that we will see a museum's collection in jeopardy because of a Chapter 9 bankruptcy filing by a city. And even if, let's say, Hartford were to file under Chapter 9, the Wadsworth Athenaeum's collection is owned by the trustees of the Wadsworth Athenaeum and therefore would not potentially be an asset that would be available to the emergency manager or the judge in the plan of adjustment. Nevertheless, I go back to the same argument, which is at some point the American museum community really has to begin to articulate for itself and then for others what its significance is other than pulling in tourist revenue.
Can you talk for just a minute, though? Let's do a different hypothetical, which is that
Now you're the law professor.
Sorry. Traditional museum has a collection, has significantly more debts than assets, as a nonprofit, goes out of business. What happens to the collection? Tell people.
Well, it's happened very rarely, and so we're not entirely sure. It almost happened at the Barnes. I mean, they were down, if you look at their tax returns, their filings over a number of years, I mean, they really were down to close to their last penny before emergency aid came in through a group of foundations. And that was the big question. What would happen on the day the Barnes had the last dollar in the bank? I mean, who would pay for the guards? Who would pay for the moving company to put the works of art somewhere safe? The Fresno Museum, I think in 2010, went under and went through a Chapter 11, I believe it's Chapter 11 bankruptcy to dissolve, not a plan of reorganization. And there, Fresno the museum sold at public auction its collections to satisfy its creditors. But we've never had a major institution. We just recently, the Please Touch Museum in Philadelphia defaulted on its bond obligations, but it hasn't declared bankruptcy yet as far as I know. And that may be one of the larger ones. But small museums have been involved in bankruptcies. They tend to be institutions without large collections, though.
Let me quickly check. Who's going to have a question? Just so I know. There's going to be some questions. So I'm actually going to move in that direction. But before I do, not to get too philosophical here, but we're in a very international art fair here. What does this whole episode sort of say about American culture? Say about America? Does it say anything about America?
No, I don't think it says anything particularly American. This is an anomalous situation. The museum did what it thought was the right thing to do in 1919. No one then, no one a few years ago, thought that a major city would go bankrupt. I was thinking about New York City, thinking about 1974, when reading the Daily News one, Fed to city, drop dead. And I'm thinking, I don't remember anybody saying, let's sell Central Park then. I don't remember,
or arts from the Met.
I don't remember anybody going around saying that. There always was a feeling that there would be some kind of package that would get things back on their feet. You feel almost in a way that the city, the emergency manager, kind of lucked into this asset and is using it as kind of a red herring to divert attention from the true issues that are out there, which is this is a city that's been in decline for 50, 60 years, and but this is almost a kind of a prurient one to talk about. So. I don't think it says a lot about it. And I also think that, the poll information that I quoted, 75% of the community believes that the institution should stay intact, even at the expense of pensioners. Tells you a lot about Detroit as a city, and I think if you extrapolated and asked that question nationwide, the numbers would be there or higher.
Stephen, you feel the same way?
I just have a quick question, though, for Dennis. Dennis, have any polls been done just with pensioners as to what they would feel? Because that could be extremely valuable data if it went the right way.
Maybe the marketing agency that you would like to hire should be doing the... So I think this is a good moment to take a few questions. We have a little time. If you wouldn't mind, since we're recording, I believe we are, just say also that there was a gentleman in the back. And just, if you wouldn't mind, if you can, also tell us who you are and if you're with an institution, if you'd want to share, it's up to you. Right behind you.
Okay, thank you. With a heavy accent, I'm not too comfortable with your legal system.
Please hold it closer to your mouth.
Okay. I don't know your legal system too well because I come from far away. But question, is there the slightest chance that you go back and try to make this 1990 contract null and void, find a formal mistake or anything?
Scrivener's error.
I know pacta sunt servanda, as you say, but there's always a way. Or do you respect all contracts in the last 200 years you made?
Are you a member of the legal profession? Yes.
Not here in Europe.
Thank you.
Well, civil law, I think, has a potentially different approach than the common law does. But it would seem to me that if there had been a problem with the operating agreement entered into in the early 20th century, I don't, Dennis, correct me if I'm wrong on this, that there would be a serious, for the museum now to argue that there was an error in the contract, I think there would be a serious statute of limitations issue. How many? I think it's generally 6 years to bring an action under contract.
We found a way to do it with foreclosures. I don't know why we can't find it here. So,
but I think there are other avenues that are potentially more valuable, and also you don't want the museum to be seen as getting involved in legal technicalities, right? From my perspective, you want the museum to be riding a much different wave that is much higher.
Lady in the salmon shirt.
Hi. So
Please hold it close.
I'm interested in the strict bankruptcy law issues, and so how I think it was right on point what you said. Has anyone polled the pensioners, right? So are you watching like what's going on in Chicago with that pension issue? And I mean, I just think that that's what it comes down to. Also, the precedent when GM did not go bankrupt and the government stepped in and overrode the rights of the bondholders, I think all of that is very relevant to what might happen here.
I can tell you that the judge's decision that the pensions could be reduced today, or this week, sent a shudder across every single municipal union in this country. That had not happened before. There had been discussions about it, but that was a formal ruling in court saying that, yes, as part of a Chapter 9 bankruptcy, you can reduce people's pensions. That's a terrifying piece of news if you're a pensioner, if you've been paying into a system, if you believed that you had the full faith and credit of a city, state, municipality. So.
Other questions? There were so many before. We all answered so many questions in those last 5 minutes. Here's a question.
Hello, my name is Mark Lorenzen. I'm wondering how other cities, is there a way to protect the assets in a way where people incorporate a business or a house is homesteaded?
Yeah, this is a very unique situation because of the decision to transfer the assets early. I wanted to touch on something that Stephen said. One of the things that I've seen a couple of times is that when you liquidate a nonprofit, that the Attorney General will step in and take certain assets and reassign them to another nonprofit. And that's the kind of thing that has happened in other situations, not necessarily in an art context, but I've seen that a couple of times too, where assets, the Attorney General says for the good of, these assets are going to be merged or transferred to another nonprofit. I think I fear for the Detroit Institute of Art. I cherish it. It is an incredibly valuable resource for the world. It is an amazing collection. And when you start to go down this road, as Stephen said, boy, you don't want to spend a lot of time arguing Chapter 9 bankruptcy bankruptcy. If you're the museum, you want to argue the equitable treatment of this work. What's going to happen to it? All of the people that pay taxes year after year after year into the city of Detroit with an expectation that these were assets of the city and were for the benefit of the community.
Yes, lady in the yellow shirt here. The microphone is still on its way.
Hi, I'm just wondering, what is the percentage of the works that that would be sold, that were paid for by the city versus the ones that were donated, and what would happen to the works that were donated, and wouldn't that also be something you could rally? My feeling is that getting the directors of museums or that sort of group, they aren't known to the public. You need to get the commercial, the people involved in the arts financially, the donors, the people with a big name that would come out and support the museum and say, if this happens to Detroit's museum, what will happen to, and use them as your scary people to what might happen to museums in other cities.
I just to speak factually, I think Christie's looked at around 1,500 works. It could be a few more, I'm not sure. The bad news is that, for example, the first Matisse that entered into an American museum collection entered into the Detroit Institute of Art collection, and it was paid for in part by the city. So those facts aren't very good. I'm going to stick with arguing the emotional aspects of this, because some of the facts are not great. Some of the really important early works that went into the collection were during this time period when the museum was being supported for acquisitions by the city. And the judge may literally go back and look at that and say, well, Here are things where they contributed all or a part of the $5,000 they paid for the Matisse, so that's a tough argument. And I agree with you. It's all about noise right now.
So I just, as we get closer to closing this down, I'm still wondering if there's something creative. Is there a kind of creative silver lining to this story? Is it possible that this admittedly outlier case might force out some creative thinking about mechanisms that currently don't exist? Because, I just want to go back. If you're a country and you're in a crisis, you have the IMF, World Bank, various mechanisms are in place to come to the rescue. If you're hit by natural calamity, you have insurance, you have FEMA, you have structures in place that when the unthinkable happens, there's a wider community that through known channels can help you. Should there be some kind of fund, rescue fund for culture that could take a percentage of every institution's whatever? Is there some idea that we can take from this so that it doesn't stare at us in the face in this kind of now what way?
I look forward to hearing what Dennis has to say. And what I would have to say about that is before you even could implement any kind of mechanism of the kind you're talking about, the arguments would have to be on the table. And so from my perspective, those arguments which have not been worked out by the cultural sector broadly, and certainly never by the American museum sector, need now to be made. I think that's one of the takeaways here. Back in 1989, in an article on the public interest in cultural property, John Henry Merriman set up what has been referred to recently as the Holy Triad. It's a hermeneutic applied to cultural property disputes. And there are three values: preservation of the works of art or the cultural property, truth, as he calls it, meaning being able to use that cultural property for the maximum educational value so we can learn about it and ourselves, and then access, public access. So I think if one were to begin with some fundamental values and start to make some essentialist arguments that would be as persuasive as the instrumental ones, then I think you could begin to think about going forward. But until the museum community is able to articulate its benefits in that way, I think it's difficult to think about creating any new mechanisms. But Dennis, I'd like to hear a more optimistic response.
I don't have a more optimistic response. We have chosen as a country to have a strong military and a strong defense. We have chosen as a country to have a strong safety net with things like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. We have chosen over and over at the federal level to protect our population in a number of different ways. We have clearly chosen not to do that with our cultural heritage, unlike a lot of European countries, unlike a lot of countries all over the world. I can't say why. We're very Calvinist in this country. Maybe that's part of it. I can't say why, but until we begin to take our cultural heritage and embrace it in a way that is reflective of how it appears the communities feel about it, I don't think this is the last jackpot situation that we're going to see cultural assets in the next decade.
Well, that would be the perfect place to end, but I'm not going to make it that easy. I'm going to put you on the spot.
I was trying to end on a downer.
No, it was so eloquent, it was so smart, it was so good. We could have ended it there, but I'm going to put you on the spot. 6 months from now, what's going to be the situation? Don't speak as a lawyer or as a theoretician. Speak from the gut. What's going to be the situation?
I'm going to decline to answer that just because I am right in the middle. But I promise you that when you look at this stuff as we go forward, and you heard what we talked about today, some of the things I spoke about here will reveal themselves to you very, very quickly. That's I apologize for kind of copping out, but we are right in the middle of this, and I just can't talk about some of the things.
Stephen, you have no excuse.
Well, all right, I would say two things. First, unless I could open up Joe Lewis's fist and look at his palm to know what's going on there, big, right? Okay, I can't answer. And so what I would do is simply flip it and say, what do you think?
Yeah, you're not from around here. What do you think?
Exactly. I think when all is said and done, good people like Stephen and the good people of Detroit and the more positive forces of this country will get together and find a solution.
I like how he left me out of that one. I appreciate that.
But he was looking at you.
Thank you very much for coming.